I would really encourage you, if this kind of stuff interests you, which it totally interests me. They have a website. It's biblicalarchaeology.org, or you just type in Biblical Archaeological Review, and you'll go to a search engine that'll send you to the website, and they'll actually let you review. They don't let you read all their stuff online. They want to make money, obviously, but they'll actually let you read the current. You have to sign up, but they'll actually let you read their current edition that is out, because now they've put everything online. Everything's digital now, obviously, but they also send out a hard copy, and then they have, so you'd have an opportunity to at least see what it's like. It's fascinating. Like I said, this is from over 30, 34 years ago, but the pictures are still relevant for what we're going to talk about tonight. And this is some Assyrian stuff, but it was the Black Obelisk is what it's called, and it's the largest obelisk that they've found to date, even today. But I really would, if this kind of stuff intrigues you, and this is part of the article from it, but basically the article is about the Assyrians and how you could use just Assyrian history to validate what the books of First Kings and Second Chronicles were talking about, with the Assyrians conquering Samaria and parts of Second Kings. So they talk about, it's really, really good. Like the kings that are mentioned on this handout are actually talked about in the Assyrian history. So if that's something that really interests you, then I would encourage you to go online and look at Biblical Archaeological Review. Like I said, they'll allow you to read their current edition for free, just to kind of test it out. They've got some really cool stuff too, like they list all of where they're digging right now. And if you ever have a bucket list thing to go on an archaeological dig, you can sign up to do it. Like, and you can pick the dig you want to be a part of, and they'll hook you up and send you out there. It's really, really cool stuff. So um, I never did it. We visited, when I was in Israel, we visited many digs. And there's a program at the University of Jerusalem, or maybe it's Hebrew College, I can't remember which one, that does, you go to class in the morning and you learn about, uh, because the Jews still teach in parables today. So the parable is the number one teaching tool that rabbis use. And so you learn all kinds of non-biblical parables, and then in the afternoon you go out on the dig site. But yeah, we were, when YCC was still a school, we were attempting to see if we couldn't do something similar to that. But so I would encourage you to just check out the website if nothing else, and it might be something interesting. Once you read this, you might think, no, that's really not up my alley, or you might go, this is really cool. So that's the first handout that I'll have when we start talking about Nebuchadnezzar's golden image, because there's a lot of misconception as to what it was. And then the second handout is just a timeline, an intertestamental timeline. As we get closer to Daniel 7 through 12, these intertestamental timelines become more and more relevant, okay, because he talks a lot about them. So if you got your Bible, go to Daniel chapter 3. Just a reminder, since we are recording this for the website, and now I guess these things are also on YouTube. Our tech guy Jeremy is a stud. He's like, yeah, you're on YouTube, and I'm like, oh, great. Well, thankfully it's only the audio. So, but he says that, I don't obviously do tech or social media. I mean, you guys have all seen my phone and everything else. So, but evidently the YouTube is the huge way to get things out there, because it acts like a search engine on a computer, and you can find all kinds of stuff. So the summit classes, and then you just Google Elevation Church Billings YouTube, and I guess it comes up. But at any rate, having said all that, just please save the questions for the end. Last week, there was a question on whether or not Nebuchadnezzar was actually responsible for creating the Hanging Gardens. And the answer to that is they don't know. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon were one of the seven wonders of the world. It's the only wonder that archaeologists have never found. So they found, the lighthouse. They found where the lighthouse in Alexandria was, and the Colossus of Rhodes, all those kinds of things. they've actually found, and some of them still exist. Like I think, isn't one of the pyramids one? So, but the Hanging Gardens they never found, but they are written about through Greek, Babylonian history, even Roman history. Evidently, Nebuchadnezzar was said to have built them for his wife, who was Persian, and because she lived in a place where there were forests and lots of green, he built basically like a pyramid, and on each level he built all this greenery, and so it had to have this pretty immaculate drainage and system of ways to get water up to the top of it. So, but they've never found it, and some even archaeologists think that it may not have even been built by him. It may have been built by the Assyrians in Nineveh, because they have some sites, but they don't know. So the answer, that long answer, is all to say I have no clue. But I did spend quite a bit of time looking it up, and so that's the clue. That's the answer. All right. So Daniel chapter 3, as we've talked about, the book of Daniel can be broken either into 3 parts, or linguistically, or 2 parts if you're going with the first 6 chapters and the last 6. The 3 parts is because the first part is written in Aramaic or Hebrew, then the second part, which we're in right now, is written in Aramaic, and then the third part is in Hebrew. And I made the case last week that the book being broken into 2 languages indicates 2 programs, and we talked about this, and I think you'll see this even more today. As we said in the last couple weeks, Daniel kind of builds on itself. So every week, the stories kind of get more incredible, but also they start to build on the previous stories with regards to faith and God's sovereignty. So I believe that the 2 languages in the book indicate 2 programs. God's plan or program for the Jews, which is why part of it's written in Hebrew, and God's program or plan for the Gentiles, which is why part of it's written in Aramaic. And even though I've talked about this last week, I used the analogy of the train. Even though God has maybe 2 different programs, they both are going the direction that His divine plan, the train, is going down, right? We use the 2 tracks as 2 separate plans, but they go the same direction. They're heading toward the same ultimate goal, which is the end of Revelation, and we all go to heaven and live happily forever after, right? So, that being said, I think that He has a program for all of us, but He also has a program for the people that He calls His chosen people. And it is through, and I think this is the key to understanding Scripture in a systematic and consolidated way. We will understand the Scriptures better if we understand that God's plan for the Jews, that when He accomplishes it, it's through His plan for the Jews that He accomplishes it for the Gentiles. Go to Genesis chapter 12 real quick. Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. This is, I believe, kind of the key, the hinge to all of Scripture, and it's what's known as the Abrahamic covenant. It's when God promises Abraham 3 things. He promises him a people. He promises him a nation that people will dwell on. And then He says that the Messiah will come from him and his people. Okay? Now all 3 have been accomplished, right? It says this, "Now the Lord said to Abram, go forth from your country and from your relatives and from your father's house to the land which I will show you. I will make you a great nation." There's the first promise. "I will bless you and make your name great." That's the promise of a people. "And I will make, and you shall be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and the ones who curse you I will curse." Now this is the key part, because the Abrahamic covenant is for Jews. It is, right? And for Israel. He's, "Go to the land which I will show you." There's the land. "I'll make you a great nation." There's the people. "And I'll make your name great, and you will be a blessing to all." Look at the last phrase. "And in you all the families of the earth will be blessed." Not just the Jews there, but all of us. And that's the coming of the Messiah. And I think that last phrase there, and again, Acts 17:11, search the Scriptures to see if these things are so. But that last phrase there is the phrase that shows that the 2 tracks that have God's train, His divine plan on them, are going the same direction. parallel, right? So God is accomplishing his plan through Israel for us. Does that make sense? That's why I think the Old Testament is relevant. That's why we study it, and I think we should continue to study it. And I think there's plenty of application, but I also think it's very, very important to understand that the best way to understand Scripture in a systematic and consolidated way is through his plan for the Jews that he accomplishes his plan for the Gentiles. So keep that in mind, because today we're going to see two worlds collide. We're going to see three Jews who wouldn't bow the knee to the greatest Gentile ruler of that age, right? And what happens when they don't, and how Nebuchadnezzar begins to transform in the way that he thinks. And he's going to have to go through a lot more in chapter 4, but we'll get to that as soon as we get to it. But, and by the way, since we all have heard the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, there's a pretty interesting question, and this question came up in seminary, actually, way back in the 90s when I was there. Where was Daniel? Like, what was the deal with that? Like, where was he? The scriptures don't tell us. People can speculate all they want. And in fact, where were Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in Daniel chapter 6 when they're told to stop, when everyone's told to stop praying? Well, that one's a little bit easier to answer, and we'll talk about that when we get to Daniel chapter 6. But Daniel chapter 3, it's like Reb Tevye and Fiddler on the Roof. I tell you, I don't know. We don't know where he was. You know, some speculate that he did bow. That seems to go directly out of character for the whole book. There are some that say that because he was given, promoted in verse 48 of chapter 2 to make him ruler over the whole province of Babylon, that he wasn't around. But that may be kind of troublesome, because in verse 2 of chapter 3, as we'll see today, it said that Nebuchadnezzar wanted all the political leaders to come see his golden image, right? My theory would be, and this has also been, it's not a new theory, and again, none of this is substantiated. None of this can be backed up by any kind of historical or biblical proof text. But my theory is because of how trusted Daniel was, especially with the first 2 chapters and what he had been doing, and his ability to interpret a dream that Nebuchadnezzar didn't even share with anybody, that he may have been exempted from it, because obviously he and Nebuchadnezzar, because Daniel doesn't get thrown in the lion's den until there's a Persian king in charge. Okay? But whatever the case, be thinking about that, because there's just no, like, scholars will just go, we don't know. Like, so they can speculate, but it's just not something that they can even come up with. So, having said that, God's agenda for his people includes his agenda for the rest of humanity as well. So as we've seen the past 2 weeks, and as we'll see today or this evening, God's plan for his chosen people is interwoven with his plan for the Gentiles. And in this way, along with the train analogy, we can also see another analogy. It's almost as if God is creating a tapestry, right? It's this one amazing picture that's unfolding as he intricately weaves together the fabric of down through history of his plan for humanity. I mean, when I teach the Bible at Montana Bible College or anywhere else that I've ever taught it, I always try to explain the Bible this way. You have the first 11 chapters of Genesis, and they're about ancient history. And then in chapter 12, something changes, because the focus becomes on one family and 4 generations of that family in Genesis. And then in the book of Exodus, that family, in between Genesis and Exodus, 430 years, that family has become a nation, right? And we know, you go through, but down through the Old Testament, God kind of reveals his plan little by little by little. Genesis 12, verses 1 through 3 says, hey, Abe, I'm going to make you into a nation. I'm going to give you this land, and you're going to be a blessing to all the families of the earth. He doesn't give him any details. And then a few chapters later, he institutes circumcision. But he still doesn't give him any details. And then the plan unfolds as things unfold, right? And then we get to the Davidic covenant, where God says, okay, remember that Messiah I promised to Abraham hundreds of years ago? Well, guess what? That Messiah is going to come from the line of David. And then he gets to Jeremiah and he gives the new covenant. And he says, oh, and by the way, once the Messiah comes, after he leaves, we're going to give the gift of the Holy Spirit. It's like a puzzle, okay? And when you put a puzzle together, usually anyone that's ever put puzzles together, when my daughter was young, she loved puzzles. She loved them. So what she would do, when we put puzzles together, what do you start? You start with the border, right? You find the end pieces, and then you start. And that's kind of what we have with scriptures and prophecy unfolding. Now, because we live in 2025 and we don't live back in, 2000 BC, we have a lot more pieces of the puzzle put into the puzzle. We have a pretty good picture of the puzzle, don't we? But there's a lot of pieces, like in Daniel, the latter chapters of Daniel, the book of Revelation, some of the other end times prophetic stuff. There's a lot of those pieces that are still yet to be filled in. But we have some pretty big pieces, don't we? And that's kind of how I think we have to look at this, where it's a picture that's coming together of a masterpiece by the divine artist himself. So while today we'll be looking at God's divine sovereignty expressed through his dealings with Gentiles, we'll also note that some of God's chosen people, through their obedience, play a key role in the implementation of this plan. So let's look at, we're going to actually start in Daniel chapter 2, verses 31 through 35. Because remember what I said, the book builds on itself. This is when Daniel interprets the dream. We talked about this last week. You, O king, were looking, and behold, there was a single great statue. That statue, which was large and extraordinary and of extraordinary splendor, was standing in front of you, and its appearance was awesome. The head of the statue was made of fine gold, its breast and its arms of silver, its belly and its thighs of bronze. Okay, go down to verses 36 through 38 of that chapter. This was the dream. Now we will tell its interpretation before the king. You, O king, are the king of kings, to whom the God of heaven has given the kingdom, the power and strength and of the glory. And wherever the sons of men dwell, or the beasts of the field, or the birds of the sky, he has given them into your hand and has caused you to rule over them all. You are the head of gold. Catch that? Daniel not only identifies Babylon, the empire, as the golden head, he specifically in his interpretation says, it's you, Nebuchadnezzar. You're the head of gold, which would make sense because Babylon was the greatest empire of that time, and Nebuchadnezzar was its greatest king by far. It's not even close. Immediately after he died, the kingdom started to decline. Okay? Now fast forward to chapter 3, verses 1 through 7. Mandy, can you do me a favor? Will you shut that door right there? Thank you. I can hear the coach. I'm having like PTSD flashbacks of my coach. I'm wanting to fall into the push-up position or something. And nobody wants to see that. All right. So fast forward. Keep that in mind. Keep Daniel telling Nebuchadnezzar, you are the head of gold. You're the king of kings. The God of heaven has blessed you with this amazing kingdom, this kingdom and this empire that's bigger than any that human history has seen. Now look at verses 1 through 7. Nebuchadnezzar, the king, made an image of gold, the height of which was 60 cubits, and its width 6 cubits. He set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king sent word to assemble the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, and all the rulers of the provinces to come up to the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. Then the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the judges, the magistrates, all the rulers of the provinces were assembled for the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up, and they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then the herald loudly proclaimed, "To you the command is given, O peoples, nations, and men of every language." At that moment, you hear the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, bagpipe, and all kinds of music. You are to fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king has set up. But whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast in the midst of a furnace of blazing fire. Therefore, at that time, when all the peoples heard the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, I don't know what a trigon or a psaltery are, so don't ask me at the end of class. I don't know. But I think it's interesting that they have bagpipes. That's kind of cool. So take that, Scotland. Anyway, all right, of all kinds of music, all the peoples, nations, and men of every language fell down and worshiped the golden image that the king Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Now, like I said, I read verses in chapter 2 first because Nebuchadnezzar's dream is directly related to his decision to build a monument for himself and his reign. Okay, you catch that? The image was made entirely of gold, and we're going to talk about what it looked like here in a minute. So in the past 2 weeks, we've seen two amazing examples of faithfulness to the one true God. And the God that is to be praised and whose laws to be followed and whose promises are to be trusted. The reliance on Yahweh to interpret the dream of the king or the following of the dietary laws by Daniel and his friends have been two examples of how we see 4 members of God's chosen people remaining faithful to him despite their circumstances. We've seen them involuntarily inserted into a Gentile world full of idolatry and immorality, yet they remain faithful to the true God and judge. But even after Daniel's proper telling and interpreting of a dream that Nebuchadnezzar didn't even tell to anybody else, and think of how hard-headed and stubborn people can be, right? I mean, it's just so true. The evidence is right there. I mean, Daniel told him what his dream was, and then he explained it to him, right? Even after that, and even after Daniel gave God credit for both, Nebuchadnezzar still looked to honor himself and not God. So, God is going to use 3 faithful young men, we don't know where Daniel was, men of his chosen people to demonstrate his sovereignty. And by the way, we're going to see some anti-Semitism in this story. And remember what I've been saying the past 2 weeks as well. And I'll beat the dead horse over and over again. We'll review so much because, again, it builds on itself. If we're faithful in the little things, we'll have the opportunity to do great things for the kingdom. So Nebuchadnezzar makes an image of gold. Because it was entirely made of gold, we can discern that because Nebuchadnezzar was identified by Daniel as the golden head of the image, in chapter 2, verse 38, Nebuchadnezzar was honoring himself with the construction of the image. If you look at the Septuagint, it adds the phrase, this is really, really cool. In the Septuagint, and for those of you that don't know what that is, I'll tell you in just a second. In the Septuagint, in chapter 3, verse 1, this is how it would read. In the 18th year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, the king made an image of gold, the height of which was 60 cubits and its width 6 cubits. He set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. So, we don't have it in our Bible, but the LXX, and what the LXX or the Septuagint is it was the Old Testament translated into Greek. Okay? By the 2nd and 3rd century BC, the Hebrew people, the Jewish people, had been so Hellenized by Greek culture that most of them didn't even speak Hebrew anymore. And so the only way that they could follow their Levitical laws and their religious practices was to have a Greek Bible or have somebody interpret the Old Testament written in Hebrew for them. Okay? You following me so far? Now, what makes this super significant is this is why when we get to the New Testament and we see the Sadducees and the Pharisees, those guys could read Hebrew, so they could interpret the Old Testament the way that it was originally written, and that's why they had so much clout. There's 4 there, so you can use them. Okay? If you look on this timeline, you'll see on the second line that between 251 and 200 BC, the Septuagint was translated. Okay? Now hang on to that for just a second, because we're going to come back to the Septuagint here in a minute and talk about why the Septuagint probably was accurate in its adding this. But if you do the math, if you look at your handout that I gave you 2 weeks ago on the second page, and you look at when Nebuchadnezzar became king, he became king after his father Nabopolassar died in 605 BC. We're going to talk a lot about Nebuchadnezzar next week. I've got a lot of historical information on him that'll help with understanding chapter 4. Okay? But if Nebuchadnezzar became king in 605 BC, and the Septuagint is accurate, and I'm going to tell you why I think it is here in a minute, then that means that the year that he would have built this image of gold would have been in 587 BC, which is the same year, if you look on your timeline of historical Israel, is the same year he besieged the city of Jerusalem one last time. And he actually took the city in 586. It was like the last holdout, those unruly Jews who rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar 3 times. And in 587, he said, enough is enough. So he didn't just take them like he had done the first 2 times and take the city. He leveled the city. He said, we're not doing this anymore. And that ended up happening in 586. But in 587 is when he besieged the city one last time and leveled it. So if the LXX is accurate, and I think it is, then the symbolic nature of the events of the fiery furnace and the golden image show without a shadow of a doubt that God's divine plan for his chosen people and all people are not thwarted by Israel's disobedience or our disobedience. God's promised land was overrun by the Babylonians. His promised people have been carted off to exile, and his promised city and his house, the temple, have been leveled. They've been destroyed. But guess what? He's still God. He's still in control, because he doesn't dwell in a house made by human hands. We've talked about that, and now with the Holy Spirit, he dwells in our hearts. So why do I believe the Septuagint? It's based on history. The events of chapter 3 would fit with what happened to Jerusalem. Nebuchadnezzar knew Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were Jews. They were his advisors. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, right? He knew the last resistance to his complete control was their holy city. When we get to Daniel chapter 6, we're going to talk about Jewish prayer rituals. And the Muslims copied this from the Jews, but the Jews, when they were carted off to exile, when they pray, which they do 3 times a day, sometimes 2 times a day, they always prayed towards Jerusalem. Okay? And so that's why Daniel would open his window probably to pray towards Jerusalem. That's just what they would do. That was their ritual. Nebuchadnezzar knew what Jerusalem was, and he knew what it meant to them. Okay? He knew what their temple represented and what their city represented. He knew that they served Yahweh above all others. So he could see Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah's refusal to bow as the same defiance he was witnessing in Jerusalem, which is why he would have been so angry. Plus, there's this little piece of information. The Septuagint was translated between, as you can see in your handout, 251 and 200 BC by the Jews in Alexandria, Egypt. Okay? Now, why is that significant historically? Because at that time, Alexandria in Egypt was the home of the world's largest and greatest library. Now, we think of libraries, we think of books, right? They didn't have books, they had scrolls. But archaeologists and historians estimate that the Alexandrian library had anywhere from 500,000 to 1 million books or scrolls in it. And it's all historical information. Now, why do I tell you that? Well, because when Alexander conquered the Persian Empire, he took Babylon, and Babylon became Alexander's capital. He didn't go back to Macedonia. He didn't make Athens or Sparta his capital. He made Babylon his capital. And when he died, one of his generals, because he didn't have a male heir, by the name of Ptolemy, took over the area which was Palestine in Egypt today, right? That was his area to rule. The empire, the Greek Empire, got split up into 4 parts, okay? They ended up fighting each other constantly, okay? We talked about that a little bit last week. Well, what is significant about Ptolemy is of all of Alexander's generals, Ptolemy was like the intellect of the bunch, okay? And so when Alexander died and Ptolemy was given the part of Alexander's kingdom that he was given, which included Alexandria, Egypt, he took most of Babylon's written history with him to the capital of the Ptolemaic Empire, which was Alexandria. So all of the written history that was used to translate the Old Testament into Greek from Hebrew was done by Jews that had access to the world's largest library at that time. Is this speculation? Yeah, but it's pretty good speculation, right? And what I like about it is it makes sense. For me, I'm okay with speculation from a biblical standpoint if it makes common sense and it makes historical sense, and it does. Now, is that a hill I'm willing to die on? No, because it's just history. The LXX could be dead wrong, right? They could, and because they, wrote it when they wrote it, they could have added that just to make it connect. But I just don't think that that's the case. They didn't do a lot of that. Most of the problems with the translation of the LXX or the Septuagint is due to the fact that there are a lot of Hebrew words that have no equivalent in the Greek language, right? And a lot of languages are like that, where they just don't have, there's no equivalent for it. You don't have certain words that the English language has and vice versa. A word that I can think of in Spanish that I asked Edgar about is sobremesa. And it basically means it's more of an event than it is the definition of a word. It basically means reclining and talking and fellowshipping after a meal, right? It's why, they take siestas and all that after and we don't have an equivalent for it because in Western culture, lunch is over, I got to get back to work, or I got another meeting to go to, or whatever. We got one thing right after the other. They're like, no, we're going to sit here for a while, right? So there's just no English equivalent to the Spanish word sobremesa, okay? All right, having said all that, the king constructed his golden image. Now, the word image in Hebrew or in Aramaic is tselem. It would be spelled in English T-S-E-L-E-M. And it means image, but it also means idol. Okay? It can also mean form or figure. It is similar to the Hebrew word selem, which is S-E-L-E-M, and has a similar translation, but it probably wasn't, as we were all taught in Sunday school class, an image of a human form. And the reason for that is its dimensions. It was 60 cubits tall and 6 cubits in diameter or wide. A cubit is 18 inches, okay? So 60 cubits would mean that it was 90 feet tall. It's pretty big. Like it's almost a 9-story building, okay? But its width was 6 cubits, so it was only 9 feet wide. It was probably a tower of solid gold, or what archaeologists call a very large obelisk. I give these to Pat. You guys can pass them out here. I'll do it this way. I got this article from Biblical Archaeological Review because there are pictures of the obelisks that have been found. Now, this one that is talked about based on its dimensions has not been found. The picture that you'll see on the very first page, on page 58 of Biblical Archaeological Review, is what's known as the Black Obelisk. It is the tallest and largest obelisk that archaeologists have found, and that's still true to this day, even though this was written in 1991. I'll just read the little caption underneath it. You guys can read. The article is mostly about Assyrian history. Discovered in Nimrud, that's a city, in 1846 by Austin Henry Layard, this 6.5 foot high, four-sided monolith, known simply as the Black Obelisk, records ancient Israel's obeisance to Assyria during a turbulent period in Israel's history. It all began with a coup d'etat by a garrison commander named Jehu, which we've read all about him in the Bible, right? Now, the obelisk, and by the way, this thing right here, this Black Obelisk, is the reason many parts of the historical books can be believed when they talk about the Assyrians, okay? But I'm going to explain to you what it is. If you turn the page to the third page, it's actually page 60, you'll see another obelisk there, okay? This obelisk, as you can see, it looks like it's this one right here. This obelisk is a hexagon, or maybe it's a pentagon. No, it's a hexagon. And the article talks about all of the things that it talks about, okay? Basically, what they would do is they would build these monuments, and then they would record everything on it, okay? All their history. So let me explain to you how it worked. Prisms and obelisks were very common in the ancient world, and they've been super enlightening from a historical standpoint when they've been discovered. Okay? And I think this would also bolster why the Septuagint added 587 BC as the year it was constructed, because with the fall of Jerusalem, Nebuchadnezzar's reign and power would have been complete, something he would have wanted to celebrate and monumentally remember. So, while it probably wasn't a human image, it was constructed to honor a human. Therefore, when King Nebuchadnezzar demanded all the government officials come bow down before it, he was in essence telling them to worship him. Now, here's what would happen with what they did with an obelisk, and this is really important to understand. The ancients kings would do this. They would, on the obelisk, have their scribes engrave all of their victories. Remember, they were considered divine. Kings and queens were considered gods and goddesses. So defeats weren't documented because, gods don't lose, right? But victories were. And so, and this is where the biblical account, because the biblical account is not scared to talk about defeat, because sin, that's what sin is ultimately, right? But in the biblical account, they'll talk about defeats of Assyria, but the Assyrians never mention those accounts. And if they do, they'll blame something else, okay? But these things, when they were constructed, were either pictorials of historical battles and accomplishments, or they were linguistic in nature. Are you tracking with me so far? So, if the golden image, and again, Acts 17:11, if the golden image was an obelisk, which based on its dimensions would make sense, right? It probably recounted all of Nebuchadnezzar's great accomplishments in the 40 plus years of his, I think it was 40 plus years of his, I think he died, maybe not quite 40. 43 years of his reign. Math is hard with BC because you're going backwards, right? So, he'd have all this stuff to talk about when he had consolidated his empire in that, 20-year period. And so he wants them to say, I am the king of kings. I'm the king of all the kingdoms. I am the head of gold. You see what I'm saying? And so it makes a lot of sense. He was telling them to worship him. And because he assembled all the politicians and political and military figures in the empire, every one of those groups of people that is talked about in verses 2 and 3 was a political figure or a military figure. Because they were the ones that he assembled, it would have symbolized his complete control, which is, by the way, another argument for why the Septuagint was right. He knew it was just a matter of time before Babylon was going to fall. The Babylonians did in 587 what the Romans would do. The Romans got so mad at the Jews when they conquered the city in 70 AD that they were so ticked off because the Jews were outsmarting them at every way, and the Jews knew that they were going to lose, and they were fighting for literally their very lives, that the Romans built a wall around the city of Jerusalem so nobody could escape once they got into the city, and that's what they slaughtered everybody, right? So, but Babylon did something similar. They built a wall around the city. They're like, we're not messing around with you anymore. And so once you do that, you know it's only a matter of time. The city wasn't going to run out of water, but it was going to run out of food. And in the book of Ezekiel and in the book of Jeremiah and in the book of Lamentations, it talks about how mothers were unable to produce milk to feed their babies. So the baby died of starvation, and because everyone else was starving, they ate the babies. Yeah, so I'm not going to go there. Anyway, but all that to say, he knew it was only a matter of time before it was over. So this image, and the image that I kind of get is a smaller version of like the Washington Monument. Okay, that kind of an image. Okay, to put it into current cultural perspective. But the Washington Monument is 555 feet tall, and this one is 90 feet tall. It was constructed on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Now, by stating that it was in the province of Babylon, it indicates that it was constructed somewhere close to the city of Babylon. And the word Dura literally means circle. Okay? So what that means is that, but it can also be translated as wall. So either it was constructed on the plain of Babylon, which is maybe would have been right outside the city, or it was constructed in the city itself, because in the very main part of the city, in the middle of the city of Babylon, there was a 3.5 square mile, like Central Park type thing. Okay? And so it was either built there, or it was built right outside the city walls on the plain of Dura, which is in the province of Babylon. Now, regardless of where it was in proximity to the city itself, it would have been an impressive monument. Imagine a 90-foot tall, 9-foot wide tower made completely of gold. That is pretty amazing. So the tower is constructed and the order is made, bow down and worship the tower. In other words, worship Nebuchadnezzar, because whenever music is played. And now, why would they list all the instruments and why music? Well, this is how we also know that Nebuchadnezzar was demanding that the people worship him. Because what are psalms? They're prayers sung to God. And when you read the book of Psalms, many of the psalms will even instruct you what kind of instruments should be used when you're singing such and such a psalm, right? So, psalms are songs of worship. In other words, Nebuchadnezzar was doing the same thing. He was demanding that they use worship psalms to him, who was a false god. And if they didn't do it, they're barbecue, in essence, right? They're going to be thrown in the fiery furnace. And as is always the case throughout human history, anti-Semitism reared its ugly head. Look at verses 8 through 12. For this reason, at that time, certain Chaldeans came forward and brought charges against the Jews. That word, brought charges, you may have something different in your English version. I use the NASB. That word in Aramaic is keratz. It's Qerats. It literally means to slander. Okay, so it goes a little bit beyond just bringing a charge of, this guy did this, or they're slandering the Jews. They responded and said to Nebuchadnezzar the king, O king, live forever. You king, O king, have made a decree that every man who hears the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, bagpipe, and all kinds of music is to fall down and worship the golden image. But whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast into the midst of the furnace of blazing fire.
There are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the administration of the province of Babylon, namely Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, have disregarded you. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image which you have set up. Now, since they're going specifically after Jews, and this is obviously a politically motivated stunt, right? They're trying to take out their political enemies. This is why I don't think Daniel either bowed the knee or was even around, because he would have been included in that because they're talking about Jews, right? So I don't think that that is what's going on. But remember what I told you in weeks 1 and 2, what the names of these three men were and what they were changed to, because this plays a very, very important role and part in the understanding of the story. Hananiah meant Yahweh has been gracious. His name was changed to Shadrach, which means I am fearful. Mishael, who is what God is, was changed to Meshach, I am despised. Azariah, Yahweh has helped, to Abednego, servant of Nego, which is one of the Babylonian gods. Now I want you to think about these names today as the story of the fiery furnace unfolds, because the names basically are the story. Okay? So, these men's names had been changed, but it had not, nor would it change their nature. That nature being a faithful obedience and trust in the true God. So they won't bow. And they aren't fearful either. We'll see that in just a minute, because what they say, this is probably one of the most amazing things, what they say to him when they are charged. Okay? So they are accused by certain Chaldeans, meaning politicians basically, and I told you what the word accused means. They were being slandered. Okay? They were being God's people were being slandered even though they were being truthful to God. And they were slandering them so they could destroy them. But even though these three men were faced with the judgment of certain death, they weren't going to succumb. Their new names didn't matter. They were still who they were. Look at verses 13 through 18. Then Nebuchadnezzar, in rage and anger, gave orders to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these men were brought before the king. Nebuchadnezzar responded and said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image that I have set up? Now, if you are ready, at the moment you hear the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, and bagpipe, and all kinds of music, to fall down and worship the image that I have made, very well. But if you do not worship, you will immediately be cast into the midst of a furnace of blazing fire. And what God is there who can deliver you out of my hands?" Remember what Meshach's name, or remember what Mishael's name meant in Hebrew? Who is what God is? Well, the question Nebuchadnezzar just asked is about ready to be answered. Okay? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to give you an answer concerning this matter. If it be so, our God, whom we serve, is able to deliver us from the furnace of blazing fire, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But even if he does not, let it be known to you, O king, that we are not going to serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up." Now, in this bit of text, we see that while the three men have had their names changed, it has not changed their faith. In fact, so strong is their faith that in the Aramaic, verse 16, which in English says this, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to give you an answer concerning this matter." In the Aramaic, it literally reads this way, "O Nebuchadnezzar, are we not careful in this matter to answer you?" Now, the word, this is important to understand. The word for careful in the Aramaic is kashak, and it literally means to be necessary in the sense of readiness. Okay? Careful in English, kashak, which is Chashach, literally means to be necessary in the sense of readiness. In other words, their response to Nebuchadnezzar basically was that they necessarily
had to die because of their faith. Well, if this is how it goes down, Neb, you got to kill us because we ain't bowing. That's powerful stuff, right? They were to be necessary, and their carefulness was in making sure that no, we were not considering this. This is non-negotiable. We're necessarily ready to go to the fiery furnace. That is profound if you think about it. And you know, Paul says in 2 Corinthians 5:17 that we are new creations. The Bible tells us to die to self daily, right? It's easy to say, but it's hard to do. But there's really a lot of divine irony in this case. They were being told that they needed to succumb to a new nature. Remember, their names were changed, and were to turn their backs on and renounce their faith in the name of names. But they told Nebuchadnezzar that they couldn't, so it would be necessary for him to throw them in the furnace. When I read that and how it was literally written, there's a historical figure in the 2nd century that came to mind for me. His name was St. Ignatius. I can't remember, I think it was maybe St. Ignatius was rumored, or legend had it, that he was the baby that Jesus put on his lap and said, suffer the little children that they come under, that suffer the little children to come unto me. But they don't know for sure. But St. Ignatius was one that was instructed by the disciples. And as he stood in front of the prefect of Rome that was going to burn him at the stake, which he ultimately did, the prefect gave him a chance to recant his faith. And this is what St. Ignatius said, quote, a change from that which is better to worse is impossible for us. You threaten me with a fire that is only temporal, but I confess to you about a fire that is eternal if I denounce he who has died for me. And so they burned him at the stake. That's a powerful confession right there. And that's in essence what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego said to Nebuchadnezzar. Here's the other thing. I don't think, in Acts 17:11, I don't think the means of punishment is accidental from a divinely providential perspective. Throughout the Old Testament, God's wrath and judgment is portrayed as a what? Fire. Fire came out of heaven and destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis 20, verse 24. Fire came from the presence of the Lord, killing Nadab and Abihu in Leviticus 10. Fire out of his wrath and anger destroyed the Assyrians in Nahum chapter 1. And the list goes on and on and on about the fire. In the New Testament, Jesus described his Father's eternal judgment in hell as a fire in Matthew 25 and Luke 16. And Jesus referred to hell as Gehenna, as did rabbis when writing about God's judgment and the abode of the wicked. Now, what is Gehenna? Gehenna was what is known as the Valley of Hinnom. The city of Jerusalem is surrounded on 3 sides by valleys. And then on one side is kind of a plain. That's why it makes it hard to take, and that's why they built it where they built it. The valley in the southernmost part was the Valley of Hinnom. Hinnom is Hebrew. The Greek word is Gehenna. Gehenna or Hinnom is where the wicked kings of Judah committed human sacrifice. And it was so hideous that Josiah, when he reformed the nation, turned it into a garbage dump. Okay? What's interesting about it is we don't think of the ancient peoples having trash. They did, right? They had trash, a different kind of trash, no plastics or anything like that. But they still had garbage. And they also had sewage. And it would they because of what had been done in the Valley of Hinnom in Gehenna, they sent all of the garbage and the sewage to Gehenna and they burned it. And so when Jesus would talk about hell being Gehenna, his disciples had a visual picture because they knew it was a garbage dump that was constantly and eternally burning. Because it burned 24/7, because a city that large has got a lot of trash. Last time, I don't want to gross you guys out, but I had to go out to the dump, and I had literally my entire truck bed was full of branches, except for one thing that had a few nails in it. And naturally, the lady saw it, so she made me go in the building. Now, I don't know who's been to the dump in the last few months, but I don't know what genius decided to have us throw all our trash on a concrete slab inside a building because, it stinks. And now that it's consolidated to a building, so I literally got out of the truck to unload the trash and I threw up all over the place. So, and I'm like, yeah, well, you guys, this is the result of your master plan. So you get to clean this up. I'm not doing it. So I unloaded all the branches, gagging, and drove off. Branches and vomit and remember the old days when you just back your truck up to like the ledge and you dump it over the end into one of those big containers and then a truck would roll up? And what was wrong with that? And then the first one they built burned to the ground because of the trash. Don't give me, anyway, sorry. Anyway, getting back to that. So it would be like if the dump burned all our trash. It would constantly, and I've waited in line to get to do it. Like, just the amounts of trash it's pretty disgusting, but it is what it is. So, having said that, even in Revelation, John writes of hell as a lake of fire. So we see then that the wrath and punishment of God throughout Scripture is represented by fire and brimstone reserved, and here's the key, for wicked, unrighteous, non-believers who have rejected God. It is not for those who have believed in him, and especially for those who are faithful to his word, like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So because of this, the fiery wrath of a false god cannot do what the fiery wrath of the one true sovereign God can do, and that is burn those who will not idolatrously bend the knee. Fiery judgment from God was not reserved for those who believe in his name. So look at verses 19 to 22. And I know we're running out of time. Oh my gosh. Then Nebuchadnezzar was filled with wrath, and his facial expression was altered toward Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He answered by giving orders to heat the furnace 7 times more than it was usually heated. He commanded certain valiant warriors who were in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in order to cast them into the furnace of blazing fire. Then these men were tied up in their trousers, their coats, their caps, and their other clothes, and were cast into the midst of the furnace of blazing fire. For this reason, because the king's command was urgent, and the furnace had been made extremely hot, the flame of the fire slew those men who carried up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell into the midst of the furnace of blazing fire, still tied up. The fire was so hot that the men throwing these 3 young men into the fire were burned up. Right? Now, this is what's really interesting. The story tells us that they were fully clothed and they were bound. Now, this is really unusual because in those days, people being executed, regardless of how they were executed, were usually stripped naked first. It was done to humiliate them. Okay? So in they go. Look at verses 24 through 26. Then Nebuchadnezzar the king was astounded and stood up in haste. And he said to his high officials, "Was it not 3 men we cast bound in the midst of the fire?" They replied to the king, "Certainly, O king." He said, "Look, I see 4 men loosed and walking about in the midst of the fire without harm, and the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods." Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the door of the furnace of blazing fire. He responded and said, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, come out, you servants of the Most High God, and come here." Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the midst of the fire. So in they go. 3 righteous men judged to appease a wicked, idolatrous Gentile king. But instead of seeing them incinerated immediately, he not only sees them not burn, but he also sees another amazing thing. There are 4, not 3 men in the furnace, not burning. Now, there has been some theological dispute as to what Nebuchadnezzar called the 4th man. The King James Version says that he called him the Son of God, but that translation is probably inaccurate. It is probably better rendered a son of the gods, and here is why. First,
using the article with the Son of God, unless revealed to him, which is possible. So, I mean, I'm using my weakest argument first. Nebuchadnezzar wouldn't have had any clue about the triune Godhead, let alone the roles of Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit within the Trinity. And the second reason, and this is my best reason, it's a linguistic one. The Aramaic word for God here is Elohim, not Elohim, Elohim. So it's Elahim. And it is plural. Whenever that form is used, it's plural. So it's gods. So whether you said the son of gods or a son of the gods, again, it's an interesting thing. And we're going to be talking about that word more because it's used more in Daniel chapter 6. In other words, while the fourth person in the furnace could have been the pre-incarnate Christ, it probably was an angel, because angels are referred to throughout the Bible as sons of God. But he is referred to as a man, although angels are as well, especially in the book of Genesis. Regardless of who it is, he is walking around with the three. Now, that's also symbolic. The only thing that burned off of these men were their bindings. Catch that? Look at Nebuchadnezzar. He says, was it not 3 men we cast into the fire? They replied, certainly, O king. Look, I see 4 men loosed and walking about around in the midst of the fire without harm. Their clothes aren't burned, their skin isn't burned, their hair isn't burned, their eyebrows aren't burned. Only the bindings come off. How interesting is that? Nothing was burned but the bindings. I think that's a really good application for us as we walk around in the midst of the fires of this world and culture. Do they bind us, or has our faith cast off the bindings and freed us?
This is a really good one for me. I try to not read the news about 2 or 3 days a week. And the reason is because I get so frustrated reading it and get so angry, right? But it's just bindings, right? I mean, if you think about it, it's just binding me. God's in control. Things can get bad. Things can be horrible. All of the horrible things that are happening, and murders and wars and all the things, God's still in control. So am I going to let that bind me while I walk through the fires of life? Or am I going to say, all right, Lord? And I think it's important that we stay up to date on current events, especially as you're going to see when we get later in the book of Daniel. But we can't be bound by that kind of stuff. So Nebuchadnezzar, interestingly enough, this is really interesting to me, and it speaks to his fear. He only demanded that the 3 men come out. You catch that? He didn't tell the 4th guy to come out. In verse 26, he said, you 3 come out. He didn't say anything to the 4th guy, right? So I think we have something going on here. He calls them servants of the Most High God. If you literally translate that in the Aramaic, it says servants of God, the Most High. The article is present there, and by moving the article the in between it, instead of servants of the Most High God to servants of God, the Most High, Nebuchadnezzar realized in that moment that these 3 men, like Daniel, worshiped the true God. But as we're going to see next week, he didn't buy in yet. Not yet. Took him some time. Took him a really bad situation, medical condition, but we'll get to that next week. So the satraps, verse 27, the prefects, the governors, the king's high officials gathered around and saw in regard to these men that the fire had no effect on the bodies of these men, nor was the hair on their heads singed, nor were their trousers damaged, nor had the smell of fire even come upon them. Now you sit around a campfire, you get home from the campfire, you shower and everything, you still smell like campfire for 4 days. You have to wash your clothes 8 times, right? Nebuchadnezzar responded and said, blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered the servants who put their trust in him, violating the king's command, and yielded up their bodies so as not to worship or serve any god except their own God. Therefore, I make a decree that any people, nation, or tongue that speaks anything offensive against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb, and their houses reduced to rubbish.
heap, inasmuch as there is no other God who is able to deliver in this way. Then the king caused Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to prosper in the province of Babylon. So, all of Nebuchadnezzar's political officials throughout the empire witnessed the miracle, which seems to indicate that it happened right after the obelisk was erected. But in their presence, Nebuchadnezzar praised the Most High God for his faithful provision to those who put their trust in him. The word in Aramaic for blessed is barak. It's B-E-R-A-K. And it does mean blessed, but it also means to kneel, as in to take a knee. In other words, it can be blessed. Let me read that again. In other words, it can be blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, or it can mean kneel before the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Now, think of the irony here. What were they asked to do? What got them in this pickle in the first place? They wouldn't do what? Kneel. This happens, and now the one who threw them in there is saying, everybody kneel, except for him. Yep. So, there's divine irony. They were thrown into the furnace because they would not kneel, but because of their faithfulness to the great I Am, they were saved, and it caused everybody else in positions of power to kneel. So then a new decree came out of the violation of the king's old decree, and that is this. You can't be anti-Semitic, right? Remember what he said? They came after the Jews all the way back in verses 8 through 12, and specifically in verse 12. So he's like, nope, if you're caught being anti-Semitic, you'll be the ones that would be destroyed. I don't know about you guys, but this story always amazes me every time I hear it. But what's even cooler is the application. You know, like I said, if you grew up in a church setting as a little one, you heard this story, right? You've heard it in Vacation Bibles, whatever. But the application for us as adults, even as children, is pretty profound, right? We're going to be forced to make decisions and choices. And who are we going to kneel to? And if we don't, the bindings will come off. We should be freed by, even if we face persecution, like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, we should be freed by it because we know we serve the God that created the universe. And like you're going to see next week, Daniel gets pretty, I don't want to call it sarcasm, but there's some divine irony in what he says, basically, because next week he's basically going to say, you serve the gods of the stars because they believe that the stars were gods, and I serve the God that made the stars. And we need to keep that in mind. Let's pray. Lord, thank you for this day. Thank you for this amazing Sunday school story that has so much adult life application. Lord, thank you that you are indeed the great I Am. Thank you that because of our faith, we don't have to face your wrath and judgment. Thank you for your Son. And thank you for faithful examples like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego who would not bend the knee to what they knew was wrong. We love you, Lord. In your name I pray. Amen.